and cracked, right? So you're no longer the same person you were because the trap door has opened out from under you, and you have to go through that falling, that plummeting into doubts and insecurities and questioning. And I think those are important parts of anyone's spiritual experience. And the UFO contact experience forces the individual or the initiate or whatever term you want to use, the experience or the abductee, it forces them to wrestle with the really big questions. One thing I say is, it's the thinking person that will start talking about UFOs. So two people having a conversation about UFOs. And if they don't, very early in that conversation, jump to the very deep questions. Who are we? Why are we here? What does it all mean? Then they are missing something in what the message of the UFO is. If they are stuck in what's the size of the burn mark in the yard, or does it happen more in Nevada or California, then they are missing the deeper message.
What skews it for me, at least in my selective reading of the phenomenon or whatnot, leaning towards it being more of a spiritual waking experience versus an external, they're visiting from another planet experience. At the same time, I entertain both, but I lean, and I can't help that as a human being. So I lean in that direction because, again, a lot of these are accompanied by synchronicity. And so synchronicity, period, whether you're talking about it in the context of an ET experience or something completely different, it does seem to accompany sort of awakening experiences coming out of that dark night of the soul, and it almost acts as a bridge, a strange sort of synchronistic bridge between, again, that invisible, unseen dimension and then our waking reality. And the ET experience is so much like that they go hand in hand. That's how I feel. And have you seen that in your own research too?
Well, I mean, that's one of the questions I ask is, have you had a heightened amount of synchronicities in your life? When I talk to people who've had the UFO contact experience, I've sort of stopped asking it at this point because I know the answer. They'll just roll their eyes and they'll say, oh my God, I've had so many profound synchronicities that it defies all rational explanation. It's magic. Something has intersected with my life that is creating these thunderously intense synchronicities. And that would certainly be true of my life. It has calmed down a little bit now. And I think the reason it's calmed down in a funny way is that I'm kind of at the point now where I don't need anything proved to me. Mm-hmm. Like I don't need like a synchronistic, powerful experience to say that there is a phenomena at play that is very profound. I know that's taking place. I'm very confident saying that. And
well, can I?
Go ahead.
I would feel remiss not to ask you about your confirmation event while we have you here, because I think that story is your personal story, and I'd like to hear you kind of retell that.
Now, so have you? There's a video online. I'm not sure, and I've definitely written about it. It took place March 10th, 2013.
Yes.
So you're familiar with the story?
Yes, I'd like to have you talk about it, though.
Okay, good. So to tell it properly would take 45 minutes. So I'll kind of race through it a little bit. So I was coming home from a UFO conference. I had at that point had enough experiences in my life that I should have been very comfortable saying like, oh, I'm probably a UFO abductee. I wasn't. I had all those experiences, but man, I'll tell you, it is a big leap to jump off that cliff. So I was shaky. I was insecure. I couldn't come to terms with it. If I did say it, if I said it out loud, like I am a UFO abductee, it didn't feel honest. So I wouldn't say it. I would go around the block, I would say. And I even did it at the opening of this thing. It's like, well, I have the experiences that, might put me in the category possibly of someone who could have in one way or another had a UFO contact experience, maybe. And I have to walk around the block 3 times to get that out. So coming home from a UFO conference, this would have been the conference that takes place every February. It's taking place right now. I think it ran until a little over that year. So 2013, driving home, I was living in Idaho. The conference was in Arizona. If you look at a map, you got to drive through Utah. So I love driving through the desert and stuff like that. I picked these little teeny roads and I wanted to drive on wonderful back highways and stuff. And I spent a lot of time outside and such like that. So I feel very comfortable just pulling off the side of the road. I have a great big thick winter sleeping bag, a great big thick pad, no hotel. I just got tired. I pulled off to the side of the road. This is in dusty middle of nowhere, Utah. It's actually, between Beaver and Cedar City on Highway 20. Someone could look that up. Pulled off to the side of the road. I think I remembered that road being pretty, and I'd never slept there, but I was like, I'm going to sleep there. So I pull off. The sun is down. It must be about 9 o'clock at night or so. Cold, it's March, early March, freezing cold. So I pull off. It's a great spot. I lay down. It's nice and warm in my sleeping bag. I think I fell right asleep. A little while later, I woke up. I did not look at a clock at any point. So it's not like I pulled out my watch and looked at what time it is. So I don't know what time it was. I went to bed around 9, woke up, and I look on this hillside nearby, and I say to myself, that looks just like a landed flying saucer. And sure enough, like up on this hill is like this round structure, and it had lights around the edges of it. It was up on this hill. It looked big. And my thought was like, oh, that looks like a house, like a trophy home. Like someone had built like a Malibu trophy home here in southern Utah, and they put it up on top of this hill. And I looked at it, and it kind of looked like a landed flying saucer. And I said to myself, hey, listen, I'm super psychic. I've got all these intuitive senses. I feel like I'm pretty dynamic in that sense. And I feel like if this was a UFO, I would know it. I would totally know it. So I kind of just tapped into my inner quiet side and just said, okay, nothing. I felt nothing at all. Zero, zilch. Every little like psychic knob was like at 0. And I'm like, okay. So I rolled over and went to bed. And I woke up a little while later. There it was again. And at that point, there was a coyote howling really close. And I was like, oh, okay, this coyote's howling. This thing's right there. I mean, like really close. I mean, at that point, I'd lived out west for like 25 years. And so I'd heard a lot of coyotes. I'd never, ever heard one that close. It seemed like I could almost take a little dog biscuit and just toss it like underhand, like just whoop. And this coyote could catch it in its mouth. I never saw it. There was kind of sagebrush and bushes around it. It felt like it was like I could almost pet it. I wasn't scared at all. I went back to sleep. A little while later, I woke up again. There was a light on the other side of this bush. If it was a car, it didn't seem like a car. It didn't seem like anyone with a flashlight. And I couldn't see on the other side of this bush. And so there was a light there, and I went back to sleep. Now so I woke up again and then just said, oh, I feel refreshed. I'll just start driving. And I got in the car, and I don't actually remember looking up on the hill to see if that round structure, what I thought was a round home, was up on the hill, which I had seen 3 separate times that night, very clearly. And I'm laying there. I must have stared at this thing for a half hour at times.
Were the lights on it? Were they symmetrical, or were they?
Curiously,
were they laid out more like a?
Yeah, it would be like, curiously, they were slightly off symmetrical, which I thought was unusual. So it seemed like, and I did an illustration of it that I kind of used the computer. So actually someone said like, oh, how did you get that photograph? And I'm like, that's not a photograph. I just did that using Photoshop. So you imagine a saucer, 2 dishes, 2 saucers, one on top of each other, and right along that seam along the edge was these little dots of light, but they weren't perfectly symmetrical. They were kind of spaced a little herky-jerky. I got up.
So you didn't see it in the morning?
I don't remember.
You don't remember looking for it?
I don't remember. It was still dark out when I started driving. Yeah. And here's another thing. It was actually, if you look up in the time, that was the day the time change takes place in spring. So I remember getting in the car and like my clock, I was listening to the radio. I'm like, what the heck? What's going on? They're like telling it's time, and this doesn't match my clock. And I was totally like, oh God, and then I realized, oh no, this is daylight savings. So I had this kind of like, oh God, something went down. The time's all screwed up, and my time's all, crazy, weird missing time event. But it wasn't. It was the clock didn't match because it was just, the time change was that morning. So I get home, I look up online, I try to figure out if there was a building there. This building was as big as it seemed to be. There would have to be, and I'm very, very skilled with maps. It would be huge. Need a road to be up there. There'd need to be telephone lines going up there, and nothing. I could see exactly where the meadow was. It was just, a little cute, pleasant meadow of sagebrush according to the satellite imagery. And I'm like, well, this came from a couple of years ago. Maybe someone just built something. I have since been back to that same exact spot. There is no building. But at that point, I had just driven away, and then I got home to my house and then tried to do a little research. Now, it was actually not that day, but the next day, I was walking in my house. So I was like standing by my desk, and then I was suddenly struck with this psychic flash. I had a very clear vision in my mind of a map of southern Utah with a straight line and 3 dots on this straight line, like 3 push pins on this straight line, like you would. And I created maps using Google Map program. So I just sat right down on my desk and I knew exactly where the westernmost dot was. And that would have been the event that had taken place 48 hours earlier, or maybe less than 48 hours earlier, would have been at that spot on Highway 20 in southern Utah near Beaver or Cedar City. I think it's between those 2 towns. And then the other location was an event that happened in the spring of 2010. And I was with this woman, Natasha, and we met at a UFO conference. I want to be very careful what I say because she doesn't feel that she has had contact experiences, and I trust her on that. But I will say she's had a lot of odd experiences in her life. So we were camping out in a tent. I'll make this one short because to tell this story properly takes a half hour. So something happened in the tent. We both woke up screaming. I remember floating. I was in this white realm. She remembers seeing a face. There was all kinds of odd things that took place that night. And I woke up that morning and had a big scratch across my chest. And the next day, when we woke up, we left that campsite and we were like, wow, what happened last night? And I remember walking around our tent, like looking for a spot on the ground where like a UFO would have left a burn mark. This is actually technically in Colorado, right across the border from Utah. It was near a town called Dolores, Colorado. Curiously, my friend Natasha had studied with Dolores Cannon. So Dolores C is where Dolores, Colorado is where we had camped, and Dolores Cannon, she had studied hypnosis. And then we eventually went and saw a shaman in the Navajo reservation, did a sweat lodge. It was an amazing experience, really wonderful. Not like life transforming or anything like that, but I found it really, really enjoyable and super cool experience. So
those are what you would consider your 2 most kind of prominent.
Yeah, there's a few others, but those are the 2 most prominent that I just shared. And so if you put a line in a map, right? So you have an easternmost line dot, which is Dolores, Colorado, and you have the westernmost dot, which is the event that took place on Highway 20 on March 10th, 2013. And then if you make a perfectly straight line between the 2, I was like, okay, in my vision, there were 3 dots. So I was like, where is this other thing? Where's this? And then when I realized, I actually was camping with Natasha the following year. That would have been 2011. I think that would have been March of 2011. We were actually at the conference and we came home together, or she drove back to my house in Idaho, and we camped on the side of the road on the Burr Trail Road just outside of Boulder, Colorado. Boulder, Utah. Sort of in the middle of the lower part of southern Utah. It's a little town called Boulder, Utah, and there's a thing called the Burr Trail Road. We're camped there. And I had been driving all day, and it was nighttime, and it was a beautiful, calm night, and this great road, and it was the coolest spot imaginable. It was just amazing, and it was cold, and just trillions of stars, and absolutely quiet, and I had been driving most of the day, so I was tired. Natasha had jet lag. She's from Germany. So she was wide awake, and I just remember she was like, Mike, what do I do? And I'm like, take a walk. And she took a walk on this road, and it was the safest place imaginable. It's amazing how the stars look there. She was saying, as she was walking down the road, she was actually sparkling. She said, I felt so electric, I was sparkling. And then she saw something. She saw an orb, a floating orb. At first she thought it was someone with a flashlight. She kind of walked up to it, and it was instead just a floating orb there, and then it went poof and disappeared. And it scared her, and she ran back to me where I had been lying and said, Mike, we got to leave. And then she told me the story, and we drove off. Now, as I was lying there kind of in this kind of peaceful, blissful way. It was just gorgeous. But there was an owl in a tree right behind me. And just like that coyote story I told earlier, where the coyote was so close, but I didn't see it. This owl was so close, hooting away. And it was a great horned owl. They have an unmistakable call. Now, I'm describing something visual, and I'm describing it verbally. So when I put the spot which I'm very good with maps, I knew exactly where I was lying in the turnoff along the Burr Trail Road. When I put my like a push pin on that spot using the Google Map program, and zoomed out a little bit, I realized I was sleeping exactly on that line. So that line is 231 miles long between Highway 20 and Dolores, Colorado. In the middle, approximately, is where Natasha saw the orb and I listened to the owl. So there's just the convergence of all these things. And I have to say that these clues were set up specifically for me. I mean, obviously there are other people out there who are kind of nerdy with maps, and I certainly am. But these clues were set up in a way that it felt like I was the only person who could solve this, right? I mean, this thing with the maps and the locations and when I realized that the center pushpin, the center dot on this straight line, lined up exactly. I mean, like, you can zoom in and make that line 1 pixel thick, and you can get right in to see the bush on the ground where the owl was. It is so precise that when I realized the precision of the map, all doubts of my experiences just melted away. At that point, I was no longer the person I once was. Like, the person I once was someone like, maybe I've had these weird experiences, but it's kind of in this place of denial and I can't go there. That ended. Like, poof, gone. And I was a new person. I was like, oh God, this is real. This is real. This really happened. And these elements, I mean, on one end, I had the coyote howling near me, and the other end, I had this shamanic experience with a sweat lodge right afterwards. And on the middle one, I had this owl hooting. Now, here's another little odd detail. So that one event took place on March 10th, where I saw the round structure. And the other two events both took place with this woman named Natasha. The one in the middle and the one at the far eastern edge. March 10th is Natasha's birthday. That's a weird little detail. And then it's like all of them took place on a new moon. All of them. It was just, so I was just, at that point, the chatter, the spinning tape loop in my head that had been incessantly since about 2007, 2008, that had been spinning in my head, unrelenting, going, this could have happened, could be real, maybe it's not real, could be real, it's kind of, maybe you can go there, let's better not to look at it, better not to deal with it, but maybe it did happen. That wishy-washy sense of not knowing just disappeared. Like, poof, now I know. And then I had a bunch of like blog posts after that where I very clearly said, whoa, this thing that happened to me then, now I can look at it a little more pragmatically without getting lost in that tape loop, without getting sidetracked by my own denial. And I connected a lot of dots very quickly after that. So there was a long story. I talked and feel free to ask any questions. But that was what I refer to as my confirmation event.
My immediate question is if you would extend that line all the way through the globe.
Oh, I tried that. I tried, figured it out, and nothing happened. It's confined to those 3 little spots. And believe me, I was like, oh gosh, if it goes this way, does it go through Area 51?
Is it a path?
As well? No, it didn't. It goes the other way. It's like, does it go through what's the place in Georgia where they have the Guidestones? Yeah, does it go through the Georgia Guidestones? And it didn't. But I tried to, believe me, and it was interesting because I knew how that line was going to play out when I saw it in that psychic vision. And then I kind of recognize that I'm going to go through the process of digging there and looking in those other directions, but I kind of knew that I wasn't going to find anything. I mean, who knows? It may go through the pyramids if you wrap around the Earth a couple times, and I was waiting for it to go through Easter Island or something like that, and it never did. Not for lack of trying. So,
but sometimes it's the unassuming places where these things happen, as was your case in the southwest or southeast corner of Utah. Yeah.
I mean, it was. So, at the time. Yeah. I mean, that's so.
What's going on along that line we may just not know about.
Maybe, but at this point, I don't think I needed anything more at that point. The synchronicity fairies, didn't need to hammer anything home. Like, they had already rung the gong, so.
Yes.
So you just brought up fairies there. More recently, I've noticed on your site that you have posted a video on fairies. So is that something you've been digging into more, or what's your interest in that subject matter and what's it telling us?
I don't have much interest in fairies at all, except that they kind of show up. They show up in the written work of Jacques Vallée. And, there's a woman, her name is Adrienne Dumas. has her own podcast that she doesn't do very often. She's like so love and light. I've spoken to her on the phone. She has a bunch of odd owl experiences, and that's the reason I talked to her. She's got this incredibly sweet sort of sing-songy voice, but she's had a fairy experience. I know a handful of people who have had fairy experiences where they basically said, yeah, I saw this fairy flying around, and they all describe it the same way. They said it looked like as if it was made out of nature, right? So it wasn't like a little Disney Tinkerbell with a little tutu on. You know, it looked like it was made of dried leaves. And that was interesting. So it's like this very sort of nature spirit thing. So yeah, so I'm not locked into the fairy. I thought that fairy documentary was great though. That's worth watching. It's posted. It was probably a couple months ago. I posted that online. It's about an hour long. It's totally worth watching. There's one guy who tells a story about seeing a fairy in Scotland that's just so great. He tells about like basically hearing music, and he's off alone, and there's two fairies, one at his foot trying to lift his toe up, if I remember this correctly, and another fairy like taking his shadow and rolling it up like it was a carpet. So as the shadow that he was casting, like one was pulling it away from his foot like they were trying to take his shadow like it was a rug. Very wild story.
I think John showed me that video.
Yeah, when I was visiting, I just showed you that one. That exact
yeah, it's
one.
great.
That's an amazing story.
Yeah. That story alone is worth watching. I think I even put the time count on it. I say, if you only watch one little segment, watch this guy.
And I guess why that especially caught my attention was my touchstone book for this subject matter is Supernatural by Graham Hancock. And I don't know if it's necessarily his work or John Mack's work, but he starts drawing parallels between the ET experience or the shamanic reflection of that experience to fairy stories, and how there are, again, it's a lot of obvious superficial differences. I mean, these are not even the same entities, quote unquote, but as far as people being taken to odd places, whether they be spaceships or caves or whatever, and they are operated on in one way, shape, or form, or forced to mate with kind of cross-species mating and these sorts of themes that repeat themselves quite often. So it's interesting to even entertain the cross-pollination between those two phenomena. And it's one really just a reflection of a over-technologized society, and really what is the difference between any of these besides the superficial is there. And I think there probably is, but at the same time, the overlap, I can't help but be intrigued by that.
Absolutely. I agree. I mean, I'm totally thunderstruck by it. And that's what I'm finding in this owl research is that, like, wow, like there's this, like there's people see, I've got stories of people, one guy in Hawaii is meditating, and he's his very first time meditating. He's like, I should try meditating. So he sits on his porch and he closes his eyes and he's like, has this really pleasant experience, and he opens his eyes and there's an owl standing in his yard. And then from that point on, has this life-altering thing where he's like open to, basically it sounds like he was open to a lot of conspiracy thought and no UFOs at all. But here's this owl that shows up when he's meditating, and he has this kind of life-altering experience. Another person sat down to meditate and basically said, like, I want to learn, if you're benevolent and you're wonderful, like, I want to meet you. And then he closes his eyes, he meditates, he opens his eyes, and there's an owl in front of him. So those don't have anything to do with UFOs, but they kind of fit the same feel of these UFO owl stories.
Is sort of a close to final question, maybe unanswerable, but we'll swing for the fences with it. I mean, what is the meaning of all this? What do you think this is pulling humanity towards, or the people who experience this? What is it pushing them towards? It's a 60-40 between light and dark, but can both be compelling us towards some sort of, I've heard the idea that there's an aspiration towards convergence. And so if these are extra dimensional beings and we're on this other plane, that the universe in its entirety would only want to converge with itself. So this kind of whatever cross-dimensional interaction is some sort of reflection of that larger process. And I guess philosophically that gels well with me, but at the same time, I mean, have you put that in any framework, or do you just not even think about it?
Oh, I think about it. Yeah. Oh gosh, it's like I'm like wallowing around in existential angst, half the time trying to make sense of this stuff. This is the simplest explanation I have for it. So like basically owls and synchronicities and UFOs all kind of play the same role, right? So owls, synchronicities, UFOs, they're on one sense, well, obviously they're not the same thing, right? They are not the same thing, but they all play the same role in people's lives, or they can. Mm-hmm. So they can have they can change people. Someone can have a synchronicity so profound that it changes their life direction. Someone can have an owl sighting so profound that it forces them to look at things reality different. Someone can have a UFO sighting that's so profound that it forces them to become a deeper thinker, let's say. And so I'm treating this research in a way that like a thought experiment, like what if these things are the same thing? So I'm trying to treat them as the same thing and see what the impact that they're having on people's lives. And what I'm finding is this stuff is just all intertwined and so tightly knotted that I can't separate one from the other anyway. So the simplest definition for the owls and the role they are playing is that they are alarm clocks. Some people can wake up with just a little teeny gentle tone, and that may be someone's owl experience. And some people need a loud clanking bell that jolts them out of sleep. And that can be, the more powerful owl experiences that I've had people have, or that I've heard from folks. So if the owl is an alarm clock, the implication is to wake up. And what is that waking up? I mean, that's an open-ended question itself, but I feel like to waking up to the fact that there is a grander and deeper reality at play. Are we tapping into the God consciousness? Are we, peering beyond the veil to where the interdimensional aliens are, holding court, or is it just a deeper sense of knowing of your own best self in a way? I don't have an answer to it, but I'm convinced there's more going on than we've been taught in high school physics class. I feel that there is something deeper at play, and these owls seem to be playing the role of alarm clock and waking folks up. So my owl experiences, which I had in a flurry, oh my God, in 2006, 7, and 8, and 9, it was off the charts. I was seeing owls. So it was crazy. It was out of control. And that was the alarm clock in a way, trying to wake me up. And it forced me down this road of self-reflection. It forced me to, if you look at my very first blog posts or the first couple, they're about owls. And they're just stories that I had never applied any kind of UFO context to them. So so owls as alarm clock, waking people up. What are you waking up to is debatable, but I feel that there's a need for humanity and waking up is just as much a metaphor as anything else in this stuff. So,
and that's great. I really like how your experience has not just humans and aliens in it. And there are many other creatures out there. And in some ways, most of the stories that I hear about UFOs are just humans and aliens. And, we're all creatures here on the spaceship Earth, and there's other creatures out there. And I love that the palette in your experience kind of taps into other creature intelligences right nearby us that we may consider just as alien. And
exactly.
I think that brings another dimension to it that helps. Maybe it's not understand it, but see it with more possibility.
Sure, a wider view rather than a myopic. You're looking through the wrong end of the telescope in a way if you only look at UFOs as being metal spaceships from some other planet. Yeah, because there's such a rich, wide tapestry of other stuff, and that tapestry has threads that connect everywhere. There's a guy out there writing a book on UFOs and food. And he contacted me ages ago and was like, gee, I'm thinking of writing this book on UFOs and food. And my advice to him was like, watch out, man. Get ready. You're going to get flooded with stuff. There's going to be unending. I think someone could write a book on UFOs and deer. I'm not going to write it. I'm like, it doesn't match my direct experience, but there's the UFO and deer. Deer have their own archetypal power and stuff like that. So, my joke is that someone could write a book on UFOs and shoelaces, and then, they would find a zillion amazing shoelace stories involving UFOs. I don't think that's, I'm being purposely kind of provocative by saying that. I don't think that's actually how it's going to play out. But, there's something about this thing that has got this kind of electric zap to it, where anyone who does, I've talked to a lot of people who've written books about UFOs, and they all say the same thing. They're like, oh my God, how do you rein it in? It just goes all over the map. It just the spider webs go everywhere.
Okay, Mike. Well, you mentioned in the beginning that you might be tying some of this into a book. Is there anything you want to tell us about that, or tell us about how your webpage is going to be going in the future?
I don't see much different going on with the web page. I know I would love to do some more podcasts. It seems like I've sort of stepped away from that a little bit. The book is, so here's what's happening. Now, I just wrote years ago, actually, I put out a little call on the blog, which is, I said, if anyone has any interesting owl stories, get a hold of me. And then I, kind of really started doing them. And then so if you Google UFOs and owls, my name is going to come up. So if you're in New Zealand and you had an interesting UFO owl story, all you got to do is I'm one Google click away. You type in UFOs, owls, I'm going to come up. And so people reach out to me, people find me if they've had these experiences. This wouldn't have been possible 10 years ago. 10 years ago was right at the dawn of the internet really functioning in that kind of way. And now it seems so second nature just to Google something. And then, so consequently what's happening is I'm at the receiving end of a lot of owl stories. They're coming in at about one a day. Like I'm getting one really good UFO owl story a day. So that's like 365 really good stories I've received in the last year. It's madness to try to think I could put all these stories in a book, and all of them are worth it, being in a book. Wow. And then, whatever, a 900-page book is not going to do anyone any good. But so I'm trying to be, I realize I have a responsibility to this topic because it is so real. People are telling me these stories in absolute earnesty. I've got so many pictures. People are like, oh, I'm a UFO abductee. Here's a picture I took in my backyard. And it is like an owl, 3 feet away from the lens of the camera. I've got a file on my desktop here with so many of these amazing owl photos that are like, oh yeah. And I just had my phone with me and this owl showed up in my garage, so. I'm looking actually sort of forward to the place when I can step away from it and go, phew, okay, the owl thing is, but I think I'm obviously the owl guy, which is fine.
You're in too deep now.
I'm I'm stuck being the owl guy, and that's fine because it's a fun project, and I'm totally engaged and excited to be doing this. But the problem is reining it in. As I said, I don't want to write a 900-page book. Whatever, there's no such thing as a best-selling UFO book. Maybe Whitley Strieber's Communion, well, that actually qualified as, but whatever. I'm going to publish a book. I feel like the book as it is now, I'm happy with it, and it just needs to be whittled down a little bit and edited down because it's just kind of madness. It's just all over the map a little bit, and I just got to clean it up and just get a little more focused, and it'll be done.
And it's a collection of reports?
It's a collection of reports. There's chapters on owl physiology because the owls actually have really interesting physiology. It's a collection of my own experiences. It's a collection of reports. I got the weirdest stuff. I was getting, for a while there, I was getting one report one day. Someone would have a report and they saw an owl from a hammock. And the next day I would get a report and someone saw a UFO from a hammock. I was lying in my hammock and saw a UFO. And the day before I got talk to someone for an hour and she told me this long, elaborate story about lying in her hammock and seeing owls, and she was a UFO abductee, and this other UFO abductee contacts me and she's seen, UFOs from a hammock. And so these stories were coming in the end, and I've organized them hopefully in a way that I make my point. So it's a little bit all over the map. I'm trying to be very open. Some of them are very, very bizarre. People channeling owls and people seeing, owls. That one story that I told you about the woman who went into the woods hoping to see an ET, instead saw an owl, had a telepathic conversation with the owl, and the owl basically said, yeah, you're not ready to see us, the ET.
Yes, so I'm to include those.
Oh yeah, I got to include it. Even though, there's some that I don't want to say skeptical of, because that's the wrong way to put it. Obviously I'm not going through and hiring a, lie detector technician to test all these people. And another thing that I'm being very cautious to do is not have any one-off stories. If there's a story in this book, it's going to have pattern behind it, so I may tell the most striking story, but there'll be at least a couple of other ones that have the same mood or the same theme or the same details. So yeah, so I'm hopefully, knock wood, it'll be out this summer. Deadlines have a way of racing. You can't quite say this summer. It might turn into who knows when. But the book itself.
You will keep us up to date on the website when it's.
Yeah, I've been totally open about it. Yeah, and in fact, I've been posting little excerpts from the book and stuff like that. So every once in a while, there's a little excerpt of it. This recently, I just posted one from a English philosopher, Mary Migley. I think I might be pronouncing her last name incorrectly, and she wrote a book called I can't remember, The Owls of Athena or something like that. And it was a book on philosophy. And she basically said the owl represented the more challenging aspects of philosophy. So it's easy to discuss the tidy, simple philosophical questions. It is tough to wrestle with the messy ones. And that's what I sense, so she came to her own conclusion on what the owl mythology meant. And that was her take on it, is that the owl was the symbol of the more challenging, difficult to categorize philosophical wanderings, which I think is great. So, and that's exactly what's playing out in the book.
One last thing I have to mention, and this was the first thing I thought of when I saw your webpage, is I'm a fan of David Lynch and Twin Peaks. And one of the recurring quotes in that television show is that the owls are not what they seem.
And I write about
visuals
that.
Of the owls.
Yeah, I did a chapter, and kind of happy with the way that turned out, called Owls in Pop Culture. And I had to address the David Lynch thing. Now, David Lynch is very tight-lipped. He doesn't do what do you call, like, the little DVD things at the end where the director, narrates the thing and said, "Oh, here's my inspiration for this." He won't do that. People are like, "Gosh, what did you mean by, Mulholland Drive?" And he won't answer those questions. So,
sure.
But but one of the things he's very clear about is that he meditates a lot. And he gets some of his inspiration from meditation. So here's that's like the shaman who meditates and paints on the cave wall. I mean, that's the same thing in a way that David Lynch is doing.
Sure.
So, and then also, if you look at the calendar of Whitley Strieber's Communion came out, which had what I feel is the first popular, I have not found an earlier reference to owls being specifically tied in to UFO contact. There may be out there. I simply haven't found it. But so that would have been in 1987 was the publication of Whitley Strieber's Communion. He has a story about, having a UFO contact experience, and he got up in the morning and told his wife, like, "Yeah, I think I saw an owl peeking through the window." And they went up to the window. It was wintertime. It was right around Christmas time, and there was snow on the windowsill and snow on the ledge just outside the window. And there was no tracks in there. So if he had seen an owl, it would have to have left some tracks. There was none. So, there's he's a beautiful writer, and so he writes this in this very eerie way. And my sense is that the owls from Twin Peaks can somehow be traced back to that episode in Whitley Strieber's Communion. I don't know who to ask, really. But that's my sense. And also, owls have been forever. There's been used as a spooky set piece in Hollywood movies. There's a great scene in The Bride of Frankenstein right at the beginning. Well, this owl shows up, and it's right as Frankenstein has fallen under the mill that he was burned at the end of the prequel with Frankenstein, and then Bride of Frankenstein, they go to the mill, and he's down there in the mud under the thing, and there's an owl there with him, which is great. So here's death and rebirth, the personified Frankenstein, right? Yeah, so, and it's a spooky thing, and it would be, anytime you see someone's like a spooky scene where they're walking through the woods alone, you're going to hear an owl hooting in the background in a Hollywood movie. So owls already have that spooky lore built in, and there's no conspiracy connected to that. That's just how, cobwebs and creaky doors there's no conspiracy about them either. So.
All right. So Mike, thank you again so much for being with us today. It's been a real pleasure.
Great. I had a half a cup of coffee before we started talking, and I apologize if I was a little bit of a motor mouth, but yeah, this was great.
It was excellent. You did an awesome job. Thank you.